Welcome to the Decent People Podcast, a production of Decential Media, where we're committed to telling the stories of the founders, builders, and visionaries who are creating a new decentralized economy and internet experience. You guys know it as Web3 or blockchain, and we're going to bring you the smartest and most interesting people in the space for intimate conversations that reveal their background, how they got into crypto in the first place, and what they're doing today to make a decentralized future a reality. Thanks so much for joining us. Make sure to check out our site at decential.io. Now to the show. Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of the Decent People Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Leising, and today we've got a Beltway insider on the show. Kristin Smith is the executive director of the Blockchain Association, whose members are a who's who of Web3 investment firms and exchanges and companies. And Kristin is doing the Lord's work in Washington, D.C. for crypto in terms of lobbying and making sure that no crazy legislation gets unnoticed. Kristin, how are you? Thank you so much for being here.
I'm great. I'm super excited to chat today because there's certainly a lot of good stuff happening in DC.
Yeah, always. It seems to be always the case. I noticed when I was looking up, doing a little research on you, on your LinkedIn page, you have a banner that says crypto here for good. I like the double entendre of that. First of all, crypto is here. It can be a positive force in the world. And then also that it's not going anywhere, which are two sentiments that I really believe in. So I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah, we can credit Sarah Milby on our team. That came to her in a dream, believe it or not. And we use it quite a bit now because, I think especially in a Washington audience, for a long time, there was a certain set of policymakers who had not gotten very deep into what these networks can do. And they really thought that this was a passing fad, that this was not something that was going to stay. But obviously, we're rebuilding our entire internet infrastructure. We're rebuilding financial services. Like these crypto assets and the tokens that run using crypto assets are here. And that, they're with the occasional exception, because there are, sort of bad guys everywhere. But for the most part, this is something that is a force for good. And so, we thought it was good to try to get that across to our DC audience.
Yeah, I love messages that come in dreams too. That's always great. And I've been covering the space since 2015, and there were periods where talking about the longevity, even I was sort of like not quite sure that we were going to make it maybe out of like the 2018 era when things just really seemed to crash. But, ever since then, I think things are just getting more and more interesting. And I agree that crypto is definitely not going anywhere. But we'll get to that. But I'd love to go back and dive into a little bit of your history and where you came from and how you got into crypto in the first place. Where were you born and where were you raised?
Yeah, no, I was born and raised in California, and then I came out to Washington, D.C. to go to college, and wasn't intending to get into the world of politics or policy, but it's kind of hard to avoid when you're in Washington. And I got sucked in and ended up working for about 10 years on Capitol Hill for a couple different senators and a congressman, and did a lot of work back then actually on internet policy. So I was super interested as we were sort of shifting from Web 1 to Web 2 as to how that sort of worked and what are the right policies that we need in that space. And then, kind of got away from that for a while, went into multi-client lobbying as many a staffer who leaves Capitol Hill does, and was kind of pulled in a bunch of different directions for a bunch of different clients I was assigned to, but really got into the work I did for one client, Overstock actually, who had early on accepted Bitcoin as payment and were very eager to invest in this space. And so it was really because of them that I went down, my own personal rabbit hole, like all of us who joined this space. And I realized that this was what was interesting to me. It reminded me of my early days working on internet policy. And so I started looking for opportunities to do this on a full-time basis, and was fortunate enough to bump into a group of companies that were looking to bring a trade association together. So I feel like it was a little bit of luck and a little bit of trying to identify something I want, and those factors merged, and here we are today.
Yeah. Preston Byrne at Overstock is one of the more interesting folks you'll come across in the space.
Yeah.
Where in California did you grow up?
I went to middle school and high school in Palos Verdes, so just south of LA.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and were you like public policy focused as a kid, or what was your
No, I
interest
um
back
I
then?
actually majored in undergrad in biology. I was very interested in what I thought was sort of like a hard science that was very like sort of truth based and fact based, and I just yeah sort of got drawn out of that, and I regret those 2 semesters of organic chemistry I took because those hours of my life I'll never get back. That's totally useless. But no, yeah, I was always interested in kind of the way the world worked, and I think it's funny. I think knowing my personality, you know, when I went to college over 20 years ago now, there weren't a lot of women in computer science. I think I actually would have majored in computer science had I understood what it was, and then I think I would have been very good at that. It was something that never crossed my mind, and so ended up in biology instead.
Yeah.
But
When I think of Palos Verdes, I always think of, do you remember the movie or the book, The Falcon and the Snowman? There
no,
were
I don't know it.
there were two teenage kids from Palos Verdes who became spies for the USSR.
Oh, how
And
cool!
yeah,
Maybe
yeah,
not cool, but no, I should check that out.
yeah. It's a crazy story. It's quite a while ago, of course, but that's something that always just pops into my head when I think of Palos Verdes. Um, were your mom and dad into science or public policy or
Yeah,
anything?
my dad was a doctor. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, and but she was very into politics and policy, and she would listen to talk radio all the time, and had very sort of strong opinions on any issue and any news. And so she spoke about that all the time, over breakfast, the state of the world. And so I do think I did get some background from her on that.
Yeah, I remember my dad would have me read the lead article in the LA Times every morning, and then we'd talk about it. So that
Yeah,
was,
yeah. I mean, it's those things matter, right? I mean, that's how you get to understand the world around you. As simple as just reading the front page of the newspaper.
yeah, yeah. It's a shame that we don't have them anymore, really, in that form. Um, so into college for marine biology, but then you took a turn into more like, then you went to DC, and that's sort of when
Yeah, no, I
things.
came to DC for college, and so while I was in school, I started interning on Capitol Hill, and I was actually on the Hill during September 11th, which was, a very sort of powerful day, and I sort of felt really optimistic at that time about government and wanting to be a part of the process. And so yeah, I started when I graduated. I started there full time, and haven't really turned back since.
What was that like being in the Capitol on September 11th? That must have been pretty scary.
Yeah, it was. I mean, in retrospect, it was like incredibly terrifying. At the time, there was a lot of confusion, and it's interesting. I didn't even have a cell phone back then.
Yeah.
We sort of all just like left the Capitol, and we're hanging out in townhouses on the Hill, and they shut down the metro and everything, and there was worries that nobody would be able to get home, and you couldn't drive because all the streets were blocked, and it was a real feeling of being trapped, but also sort of this moment of camaraderie with the people I was working with, and it's probably one of the reasons today I feel like my coworkers are my family. Feel very attached to them when we're you're building and working towards the same goal. It's you can become very close, and care very much about the people you spend time with.
Yeah. You were saying at that point in your life, you felt that politics had really a positive role in the world. Like, did that
Well,
change?
I was young. Like everybody does. No, listen, I think what I learned over time, and I think what informs what we do today at the Blockchain Association, which is work to change public policy, and there are many steps involved in that process, is that this is not, some magical black box where one day, a new policy is made. There's a process that leads up to that, and there's also politics that inform whether or not that progress is made or something can be stalled. It's there's sort of an ecosystem. There's a set of pieces that need to be put in place, and I think what's been really fun about this job at the Blockchain Association is, we essentially started from a totally blank slate. Like they they hired me, they handed me a website, and they handed me 10 member companies and a bank account that had some dues money in it. And they said, go build this. And so you have to think about like, what are the steps that you need in order to influence outcomes. And, there's a lot of pieces to that. So like one is you actually have to have ideas about what the policy should be. Mm-hmm. And that's not like a super easy thing to do, particularly for a very fast moving industry that's brand new, right? Like there's not like off the shelf solutions like you might have one with energy policy or healthcare policy or something like that. And so, that's led over time to the creation of our policy team, which are a super smart set of people headed by Jake Chervinsky that, come up with the positions by working with our member companies on those positions. So that's one piece of it. I would say another piece is you need to have relationships with people in government. And, that's, again, not a thing of luck. There are professionals in this world whose entire job it is to know the members of a certain committee or of a certain agency. And so you have to build out a team that has those relationships. You also have to build out messaging, and there's communications professionals that like specialize in policy communications and running campaigns and strategies. So you need to have that piece of functionality, and then you also need to bring the industry together, which it's you're not going to get anything done if there's a bunch of different proposals that individual like pieces of an industry are pushing. Like really what you need is to coalesce everybody behind one ask and one message. And that process takes time, but it also takes an initial commitment of organizations to come together and say, hey, like, let's work on this together and let's do it right. And so it's a process. So I think what I sort of learned from that time is that when I initially, going back to your original question, when I initially showed up, I thought, oh, it's all of these sort of smart, powerful people, and they're doing all this sort of magical things that create policy. When it's not magic, it's just a process like anything. It can break down into its parts, and you need to combine the right pieces, and you need to stay at it. And it's a lot of work, and it's sometimes a lot of dull and boring work. But it's I think we're on a good path to getting more professionals into this space, at the association or within individual companies. And as long as we keep continuing to move forward in unison, I think we're going to get some good outcomes.
Yeah. Crafting legislation. It's not magic. So you mentioned your time as a staffer on the Hill, but I believe you're with Conrad Burns. He was the Republican senator from Montana, and then Olympia Snowe, also Republican senator from Maine. And then some time in the House with Danny Rebers, who was also a Republican rep from Montana. Those all struck me as sort of like centrist Republicans that used to exist. And would you agree? And how do you think that helped develop your sort of sensibility as you're going about this now? And then do you recognize the Republican Party of today compared to where those folks were coming from?
Yeah, no, I think when I, was sort of growing up as a young adult on Capitol Hill, I did work for more middle of the road members that, understood that there was a role for government and that, it can be a tool to achieve outcomes, but also, you want to balance that with, sort of the free market. And I think particularly Olympia Snowe, she was, the most moderate of anyone I worked for. But she was very powerful because she would reach across the aisle and create a deal. And Conrad Burns as well. I actually I worked on more bills that were signed into law as a very junior staffer because things moved a lot quicker back then. And I think there were many reasons for that. One, it wasn't as, the environment wasn't as extreme as it is today, but, people spoke to one another. They would sit down and share meals together across the aisle, or there would be all these trips that senators or members of Congress would go on, and they'd bring their spouses and they would go with members across the aisle, and people were genuinely like friends with one another, and there was sort of this respect there. I think what happened over time is you had so much attention with what used to be the 24-hour news cycle that turned into sort of Twitter and social media and otherwise, and there just isn't the flexibility to build those types of friendships and relationships. They also changed a lot of the ethics rules, which made it more difficult for third parties to come in and sponsor meals or travel or things of that nature. And it sort of lost the like human personal touch that was there. But it did lead me to learn that the policies that stay are those that are actually bipartisan. When you have a compromise between Republicans and Democrats and that gets signed into law, that tends to stay. Like if you look at like the 1996 Telecom Act, like that's been in place for a while. If you kind of look at something like net neutrality, for example, that was something I worked on with Senator Snowe, where she was sort of the only Republican with a bunch of Democrats. Depending on the administration, that policy like comes or goes. There's constantly like legal litigation, things of that nature. Like what lasts and what is sustainable is bipartisan. And I think with crypto, it's actually one of the very few issues right now that is bipartisan. And so what we're trying to do is make sure we cultivate champions on the Democratic side, including on the progressive wing, and pair that with what are often sort of, libertarian type Republicans and bring them together to discuss and debate policy ideas. Because I do think at some point we are going to need some public policy changes enacted. I think, people can get by for now, but in the long run, people want to see spot market regulation. We're going to probably have some legislation related to DeFi at some point, because when you have no intermediary, that's something that ultimately is going to have to be addressed. We want that to be done by a bipartisan group so that we have actual certainty that we can live with, that's balanced and not something that's going to be challenged going forward. So I think that was something that I learned in my early days, working on the Hill, and that I'm able to take with me to this job today.
Yeah. Well, given this sort of the very partisan nature of today, I get it that you're saying we need to bring people together on both sides. How would you say you're doing in that regard?
I think we're making progress. If you asked me a year ago, I would say we are not doing very well.
Yeah.
But I think this past year, for a combination of reasons, is really one that's brought more Democratic champions to the table. I think part of the reason is because for the first time, there is an understanding among Congress that, crypto is here for good, right? That there are a lot of people working and building in their districts that care about these issues, and that they at the very least need to be open-minded to learning about it, right? That's a big shift from before. But we're also seeing, like, if you look in the Senate, we have Senators Gillibrand and Booker that are getting excited. You have Joe Biden, the Democratic president of the United States, who did an executive order saying it's important for the United States to be leading digital asset innovation. I mean, that's huge, right? You have Secretary Yellen, who could have demanded to like ban transactions with self-hosted wallets, stand up and give like a nice speech where she laid out some perfectly reasonable public policy goals. And so, we've really sort of isolated the opposition to just a couple places, most notably, I think Elizabeth Warren in the Senate, maybe Brad Sherman in the House. It depends on, how much longer he's going to hold his position of power there. And then, you have a lot of questions coming from Gary Gensler at the SEC. So those are sort of like the three pocket areas of opposition. But for the most part, the rest of Congress, at the very least, is in the crypto curious phase, which is fine. Once they get to know how this actually works and what it can do, we can usually convert them to become champion. So it takes a while, but I think that we'll continue to get bipartisan support.
Yeah. And here in California last week, Governor Gavin Newsom put out an executive order, kind of encouraging the state to be, an innovation hub and accept like and embrace digital assets here in California. You mentioned Gary Gensler. I've long thought that the Exchange Act in the 1930s is just not the right vehicle for digital assets, and that Congress needs to write new legislation. Do you think that's a reality? Like, is that doable in this environment, or is that like a 3 to 5 year term goal?
I would say it's like a 2 to 4 year journey, maybe 5. I think we're seeing, I agree, right? The SEC is in place to deal with information asymmetry between investors and and companies, right? And there's a lot of disclosure involved. And then, of course, they oversee the markets for the trading of those assets. Crypto assets, require a different kind of information, right? I mean, the health of the little entity that employs a handful of developers that help to launch a product has no bearing on whether or not that network is going to be successful, right? Like there's a whole community ultimately that has ownership over that. And it matters how many nodes are on the network or how many developers are building on the network. It doesn't matter what like the balance sheet is of whatever, Acme Labs that produced the project, right? And so that's an issue. I think if we're looking at market regulators, the CFTC doesn't have jurisdiction over commodity spot markets today, but they have a lot of regulation for very fast moving, electronic markets that they might be better suited for that kind of a task. And so we're seeing a lot of debate going on. We saw introduction of legislation in the House called the Digital Commodity Exchange Act that would expand the jurisdiction of the CFTC to take on this type of role. I mean, the real challenge is, unless it turns out that all of these crypto assets are indeed securities, which I think we have major issue with as an industry, then there is no federal regulator for these markets. There's no state regulator for these markets, right? There's money transmitter licenses, but that doesn't deal with surveillance of the markets. And so we really do need something new passed. And I think that, that is probably going to be the major focus of the industry ahead. And I think that, today there's, as you well know, there's always been this debate over our tokens, commodities, are they securities? Like, what do we do? I think a lot of the fear or a lot of the reason that's such an issue is because if you're a commodity, there's no regulation. And if you're security, there's a lot of regulation. I think if we provide reasonable regulation on the commodity side, then that debate becomes a lot easier because they're going to be regulated either way.
Yeah.
And it's just we can have a more informed discussion about that without having such high consequences as to what the classification is.
Yeah, I think what's so fascinating here is that it's certainly in terms of smart contracts and Ethereum and other similar protocols, it's programmable money. And so you've got this thing, you can have a protocol, but it's got an embedded economic function to it, which we have never seen before,
Right.
And so of course, Congress is going to have to grapple with it and the regulators are going to have to grapple with it. I was wondering, so obviously you represent now somewhere around 80 members. And, we hear a lot about what Congress doesn't know and how the learning curve is there and things like that. But I'm curious, from your members, what have you had to teach them about the political process and going up onto the Hill?
Yeah, no. So we now have 91 member companies. I don't think we've posted the last round to the website yet, but stay tuned.
Just made some news.
And it's interesting. There's a range of experience, right? I mean, a lot of these companies have brought on very thoughtful people who have, either come from the financial services world or the tech world, and they've dealt with regulation in the past. They've dealt with government relations in the past. But there has been a delay in getting that in place, right? I mean, I think that the, sort of foundational, particularly in the Bitcoin world, right? Like this is a very libertarian thing that doesn't want to engage with government. But the reality is like you have to engage with government or you're not going to get good outcomes. And if you do engage, you can make progress. It just takes time. And the earlier you can get into that cycle, the more you can form opinions and be a resource and a partner in developing those policies. So, I've had to explain to some members very basic things, starting from you really need to hire a general counsel to more advanced things like, hey, you guys are ready to, you're big enough, you have enough resources, you should open a Washington office. You should get your own team on the ground that we can coordinate with and help expand the number of people that are working in this space. It's funny, it's very popular in crypto to hire like a head of policy. Like experience other industries that think like that. Like, other industries hire like heads of government relations because they know that at the end of the day, that's what you need. But there is a lot of thinking that does need to be done on the policy side. So I think just getting more people hired and involved is important. The other one, which is, a little bit related to my day job, is trying to convince them that it's a good thing to engage politically, right? If there's a candidate that they like that's supporting crypto, you should support that candidate, because then the odds of them getting into power, and being a friend down the road are better. And so having those, using political giving as a tool for building relationships, I think is a message we're slowly starting to get through to our members as well.
Yeah, I know. I think Erica Rhodes out here in LA is going up against Brad Sherman, but I think Sherman's pretty well entrenched in the SoCal Democratic scene.
He's been around for a while.
Yeah, he's quite powerful. And then, so when you're and also I would imagine talking to your members, it's like, you should just get to know the staffers, right? Like here are the basics. Like the staffers do like the lion's share of the work.
Right. Yeah, you don't need to start by sitting down with the senator. Like you can have just as much effect speaking with the staff. And we've had situations where, the member is actually interested in this and might be open to it, but the staffer is the block, right? Because they have their own opinion that might be different. And so you need both, but it really starts with the staff, because the staff is the one writing the memos, providing the recommendations. And, a member of Congress, like imagine all the issues that they have to think about in any given day. And so starting with the staff is a really good place to start. Plus, we've noticed a real big sort of difference in, our ability to get through to someone about how this works is like directly correlated to age, right? Like the younger you are, like the better you're going to understand this. The older you are, the longer it takes. And so dealing with the staff who tend to be younger is often a good place to start for that reason as well.
Yeah, I've been having phone calls with my dad, who's 82, and he's now finally getting his head around blockchain. He's a really smart guy, but it's taken a long time. So one of the issues you guys are working on is in New York State. They're considering a bill that would basically ban proof of work mining. How is that going, and where do you think that? I would assume that you think that got off the rails at some point, and I'm curious, like, how do you think that happened?
Yeah, no. So we think, well, there's a couple things. I think that the legislation kind of comes from a place of misunderstanding the crypto world, but also misunderstanding the positive benefits that Bitcoin mining and proof of work mining have for the deployment of renewable resources. There's a lot of Bitcoin mining in New York today because they have all this hydropower upstate. It's relatively cheap. It's energy that would otherwise be lost. Why don't you capture and create value out of it? So it's been a great job generator for New York. So, I think it's completely fair to have a discussion about Bitcoin's energy use. It's going to use energy. That's not going to change. And we can talk about the energy mix that goes in to feed that demand. Like that's a conversation worth having. But to target and only have that conversation for Bitcoin mining and not other aspects of our economy, it's really just targeting crypto to be anti-crypto. New York is a challenging state to begin with, right? They're the only state that has a special bit license to do business. And if you're a resident of New York today, there are a lot of services and a lot of tokens that you don't have access to. And so if you combine the bit license with the fact that now we might have a moratorium on Bitcoin mining, the combination of those really makes one think twice about headquartering in New York. Now, maybe this is good for other states because there are a lot of states that are attracting mining. There are a lot of states that are trying to court crypto companies to headquarter there, but it has a really negative effect, not just for Bitcoin, but really for the entire crypto industry. The good news, I'd say, is we've had some really productive conversations. I mean, we're certainly not out of the woods yet. But, we want to make sure that we're going to continue to put the pressure on, continue to do meetings to educate people. And, I think the right step at this time is to maybe study the issue and let's think about a more productive way that isn't going to drive these jobs out of New York. I mean, mining is going to happen. It's going to happen somewhere. The jobs are going to happen somewhere. And it's just really, it'd be a shame to have what is currently the finance capital of the world be, not participate in this next revolution. So I think things are starting to look a little bit better there, but we're certainly not out of the woods yet.
You mentioned the different states, and I'm wondering, because, take Montana or Texas or Florida, California, different places are taking different approaches. Is that something you guys would be encouraging to sort of like, allow all these different ideas to kind of compete with each other? Or is that getting too fragmented and you'd rather have like a federal sort of structure here about it to keep it sort of like, when you have to get a money transmitter license, you have to go to every state and it's kind of a pain in the neck. How do you guys think about that in terms of the states versus the federal?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think having a federal option would be very productive because there's a lot of time and money that goes into getting these applications. And then there are visits and examinations from all of these different agencies, all for kind of the same activity, right? And so there's a lot of redundancy there. That being said, I think the states have also been really good laboratories. And so, from our perspective, I think having some sort of alternative option is there. This is something that's come up particularly in the context of stablecoin regulation for dollar-backed stablecoins. And there's some proposals. My favorite one is Senator Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania that preserves the state money transmitter license option, but also provides like a federal banking option. And so you can kind of pick or choose which one, might be appropriate there. And so I think having ideas that have different options is probably the best outcome. Just like, with banks, we have a dual banking system where you can be a state chartered bank or a federally chartered bank. So I think that a competition is a good thing, and competition among governments is also a good thing because it just provides for more regulatory options and more innovation around the best way to do that regulation.
Do you think in the stablecoin area, do you think the government itself will ever issue a digital dollar? I used to think that would be a no-brainer, but then thinking about it more deeply, that raises some serious privacy concerns because obviously there would be a blockchain element to it and your transactions are all recorded and the government could potentially know what you're spending your money on. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that. And if you think that that's going to mean it's always going to be sort of in a private sector sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at what China's doing, that's the exact thing we don't want, right? We don't want the government peering into every transaction that we make. What we do want is for individuals to be able to access financial services and make transactions in a near instantaneous way in 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, in small amounts or large amounts. And the private sector's largely stepped in to do that. So what I think is interesting is if you think about the steps that the government would have to take to come around design choices for what a digital dollar might look like, plus do a competitive process, select a vendor, create it. That's so many years down the road that I think the world is going to look a lot different than it is today. And it might be more obvious that that's not needed if other financial services adopt the stablecoin rails that are being put in place, whether it be a dollar-backed stablecoin or algorithmic or otherwise. I think that there is going to be a ton of innovation. If you look at where we are today compared to 5 years ago, where we're going to be in 5 years compared to today, I don't think any of us can actually imagine that. And so I think it's good for the government to think about these things and ask these questions. And maybe there will be a compelling reason why they decide they need one at the retail level. At the wholesale level, we already sort of have a digital currency there. And so I think asking these questions and having open discussion and debate is a good thing. Whether or not they should move forward, I think is an open question though, and is one of the reasons why it's worthy of the debate.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to wrap up, I know we've talked a little bit about the future. It sounds like you're more optimistic than pessimistic than you would have been 12 months ago.
Yeah.
what do you see, first of all, what do you see as the major short-term sort of goals that you have with the association in terms of, kind of getting your message across and hopefully, making sure that legislation that comes about is thoughtful?
Yeah, no, I think in the short term, as an association right now, we have two key priorities. We want to stop the bill in New York, because if we stop the Bitcoin mining moratorium there, that will prevent other states from doing the same thing. And so I think it's important for the industry to have a tangible win. I mean, we sort of won back during the infrastructure bill in August, but at the end of the day, we didn't actually get the language changed. We just got it narrowed through conversations and what they call a colloquy on the Senate floor. What we really need is to have a win to show that all of the pieces are in place and we're an effective industry, and that we know how to run a good campaign. The other thing that we're working on that I think is hugely important is we need the industry to coalesce around a solution. We need to come to the table with an actual plan and say, all right, we have all discussed this, we've all talked about it. Here's our proposal for how we think regulation, particularly around the spot markets, could work. It's something that will protect consumers, but that's also like not going to kill crypto, right? And so that's like easier said than done. One, it's just a space that requires a lot of very sort of technical legal thought and analysis. But two, you got to get a bunch of different players on the same page. And so that's something that we're spending a lot of time thinking through and working on. It's not ready yet. It's probably not going to be ready anytime soon. But I think if we can come together with what we want, then the politics are there. The industry is on a path politically, because largely of the ecosystem of users that are out there, that we'll be able to push something like that through. We first have to know what we want, though. And that I think is the biggest challenge that's outstanding.
Yeah, that's got to be challenging, because your members include investors to design studios to,
Yeah.
decentralized exchanges, and it just runs the gamut.
Well, and even exchanges, like centralized exchanges themselves, have very different opinions on this. So we gotta.
I noticed. I didn't see Coinbase or Gemini among your membership. Is that? I know Gemini is sort of doing its own thing.
Yeah, Gemini's for more or less always done their own thing. Coinbase was actually like the first member to ever leave the association, because they too tend to be fairly independent. And so great dialogue. They've hired in just the past year a really phenomenal team on the ground in DC. We work very closely with them. But yeah, they're a little bit more independent as well.
Yeah. One thing I've written about a little that I wanted to ask you is there was a very small change in the tax code to about it's sort of like when you send a certain amount of cash, you have to report it to the government. And they were trying to apply this to digital assets. And they were, I guess the way it was written is that if I'm remembering correctly, if you received the funds, you'd have to tell the government who sent them to you. And it just seemed like hugely problematic. And I believe that actually passed in the bill.
Yeah, no, there were several provisions in this infrastructure bill last summer. A lot of them have not been enacted yet. There's going to be, we believe, an open rulemaking process that will provide for.
That would be a Treasury, right?
Yes, within a combination of Treasury and the IRS, which is part of the Treasury Department. There's some open work to do there. There is a question around, sort of reporting on other people's activity and who has obligations to do that and who doesn't. I think it's very clear for somebody like a Coinbase, to send a 1099 at the end of the year. And the details of that need to be worked out, right? Because it's not the same as other types of 1099s. Yeah. But there's a lot of work, but there are a lot of smart crypto tax professionals, and actually there's a very small group of them. There's not a lot of people that have this specialty, but there is a small group that's doing a lot of thinking, and I think we can get all of that in a good spot. But yeah, there's a lot of open work going on at the regulatory level on that front right now.
Yeah, it gets really sticky if you think, well, I'm actually receiving these funds from a smart contract. So how do I?
Like, is a smart contract going to send something to the IRS? They don't give you a security number to that. Like it just isn't.
It's a bunch of code, right? So one of the things I love that you mentioned is sort of like how crypto just doesn't wait for anybody. It just keeps going and does what it does. And I find that really remarkable. In that vein, like what are you excited about? What do you think, what are you most optimistic about here in the short term?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm actually super optimistic about dollar-backed stablecoins. I know that that's very simple and not even to some people pure crypto, but I think having the integration of these stable coins into traditional payment services is really going to be a game changer. The other one that's been just a phenomenal educational tool with policymakers has been NFTs. And I know for those of us in the market is down. There's some concerns, but from a policymaker perspective, they're like, what is this cool thing that you can do online? And it's a great way to teach about digital scarcity. And it's weirdly, it's probably our number one most requested meeting is to talk about what an NFT is, and there's a tremendous amount of interest right there. So yeah, but beyond that, I think as more and more of these use cases come online, particularly around rebuilding the internet, having kind of more consumer choice, more control over your data, I think as those start to become more available and mainstream, then the power of what this stuff is really going to sink in with policymakers, and it will help us advance the policies that we need down the road.
Yeah, that's a great point about the stable coin, because the reality is it's very easy to digitize securities like a treasury bond or anything like that. But then to have that make any sense, you need the payment to be digital as well, which has been kind of the stumbling block. Kristin, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for the time and your insights, and good luck with everything in DC. Like I said, you're doing the Lord's work, so may it long continue.
Well, thanks, Matt. This has been great talking to you.
Yeah, take care.